So when I was preparing this, I started experiencing a little deja vu. I have this funny feeling like I've talked about this topic before, but maybe a year ago. I'm not sure. The 3 characteristics or 3 seals of the Dharma.
Last time, but this time I think we can.
Yeah, maybe I talked about this a year or so ago, but there's no video of it, and I don't have any notes from it. So this is what we'll talk about today. So the 3 characteristics of all phenomena is one way I've seen this called. Another is the 3 seals of the Dharma, or the 3 marks of the Dharma. That's another way I've seen it described. So these 3 things, these are central to the Dharma. There are lots of lists in Buddhism. These are really central. These are central ideas to understand. So the first, anicca, I think it literally means not stable. But this is usually how we translate it. We translate it as impermanent. So all things, including ourselves, are impermanent. Now we know this intellectually, but if I ask you, well, are you mortal? What's the answer? Yes, of course. And we all know science tells us eventually the sun will go supernova and the planet will end billions of years from now. Everything is impermanent. We know this intellectually, but that's not how we live. So everything arises because of lots and lots of causes and conditions. So the most obvious example would be, or an easy one to explain would be the temple. So the temple exists because Most Venerable Vin Li bought the property and remodeled the space and made it into a Buddhist temple. But of course, if we go back further, then somebody had to make the glass for the windows. Somebody produced the carpet, then somebody sold it, and somebody shipped it. There's the wood, and the drywall, and the paint. All of these things came together. And then if we keep looking back further, we get to the formation of the universe. But then, of course, according to Buddhism, this is not the first universe. There was a universe before this one and before that. We can never find the first cause. And all the causes that came together to create this space, we could never count them all. So things come together because of various causes and conditions. And things are also made up then of all these parts. So if I take a flower, pretend I'm holding a flower, and I take the leaves from the stem and I put them here. And then I take off all of the petals and I put them here. And then there's that thing, whatever you call it, that the petals are attached to. Take that off. And then if we look closely, there are all these little, there are parts to that central piece too, right? We take that all off and we take out all the pollen and we put it in another pile. So we make all these piles of things. Well, where's the flower? Right? And the flower, so the flower is made of all these parts. But when the causes and conditions for those parts to stay together and to function, when that changes, when those causes and conditions change, well, the flower comes apart. It dies, it dries up, it turns to dust. So this is what we mean when we're talking about impermanent. So when the causes and conditions change, things die or cease to be, or they transform, really. That's what's happening. It's not that there's a real ending. It's just the material transforms. So if you take that flower and you throw it outside, so the flower is dead, it's dry. You throw it outside, it breaks apart and it just becomes part of the soil again. And that gives rise to new life and so on and so on. So it's this never-ending series of things coming together and coming apart and transforming. That's what we're talking about when we talk about impermanence. So that's the first of these characteristics or seals. But then we have dukkha. Usually we translate dukkha as suffering, but it runs a range from dissatisfaction all the way up to real suffering. Suffering is a very strong, heavy word, but it really runs this range. The word dukkha is actually connected to terms referring to like a wheel being off its axle or a bone being out of joint. Okay, it's something's off, something's not right. That's the root of this word. So, as I said here, because things are impermanent, we cannot cling to them. Like we can't hold on to the wind. So, if you saw someone standing outside on a nice warm day, and there's a breeze blowing by and it feels really nice, but you saw someone standing outside doing this as the wind passed by, and then just getting really angry and crying and beating their chest and jumping up and down and saying, why? And you ask them, well, what are you doing? And they say, I'm trying to catch the wind. I like this wind. It feels so good. And they're crying and they're really upset because they can't hold on to the wind. Well, what would you think of that person? Crazy. I knew someone was going to say it. That's crazy, right? We can't hold on to the wind. But everything is that way. We spend our whole lives grasping at these temporary things and trying to hold on to them so we can pull as much happiness out of them as possible, squeeze as much pleasure out of them as possible. And what happens? What happens? These things fall apart. Situations fall apart. Things change. The objects that we like fall apart. And then we have to find something new. If you've been coming here long enough, you've heard me say this more than once. We are like drug and alcohol addicts. Every single one of us. We are constantly looking for that next hit of happiness, right? When the things that make us happy fall apart, or their ability to make us happy wears off, we get bored of them, we're constantly looking for something else and grabbing it and trying to hold on. The only difference between all of us sitting in this room and an actual drug or alcohol addict is that our addictions are socially acceptable. Money and other kinds of material wealth, food, good food, maybe fame, all of these things that we chase after trying to find happiness. Of course, then there's the flip side of that too, which is when we have to experience things that we don't like, then we're not grasping at it, we're pushing it away. You might say that we're grasping at the opposite of those things, right? This is also how we experience suffering. In those cases, though, impermanence doesn't feel like an enemy. When bad things, bad situations that come our way, when they finally change, when they go away, then we like impermanence, right? So because even though intellectually we understand that things don't last, the way we actually live in the world, the way we try to live in the world, we're rejecting impermanence, and so we experience a lot of dissatisfaction and suffering. So this is where suffering comes from. This is how our ignorance shows itself. And then we come to anatta, which means that things are empty of any inherent existence. So I talked about the flower a moment ago. So we label this thing flower, but really it's just a bunch of parts. Like I said, we take off the leaves and the petals and all of that. It's just a bunch of parts put together, and then we call it a flower. There is no real thing called a flower. Now, conventionally, we agree that there are things, like the iPod Touch here that I use for timing the meditation session, this table, this bench. It would be very awkward if we were constantly speaking and saying that temporary thing of component parts which we call a bench. We can't talk like that all the time. So we agree that this is a bench, this is a table. The problem is that we think that this table has some real table essence, and it doesn't. It's just this temporary collection of parts. So we can see easily with a flower the impermanence of a flower, if we think about it, right? You can watch it grow, and then you can pick it and put it in some water and enjoy it for a few days, and then you watch it start to fade. The color fades, it starts to dry up. Even if you give it more water, it starts to dry up, and it dies. We can see the impermanence of that. But in fact, things are constantly changing. As I am sitting here right now, the cells of my body are dying, and new cells are being formed. As we're sitting here right now, the sun and the wind, the weather that comes into contact with the temple building is actually wearing away the tiles on the roof. It's wearing things away. This bench that I'm sitting on, the molecules of this bench are changing. They're breaking down. And so eventually, in fact, I think since I've moved here, somebody put new covers on these, didn't they? They fixed them, I think. There were holes in some of them, and so I think they recovered them. So in every moment, things are constantly changing. But then again, we make that mistake. We try to hold on to these things and say, well, this is what I think it is. This flower is real. But because it's this constantly changing, even if we can't see the constant change, it's actually this constantly changing collection of parts. There's never any moment when we can hold on to anything and say, this is it, now I have it. Stop. Because it won't stop. It continues to change. Now, this sounds like, to some people, maybe boring or confusing philosophy. But this is really central to the Dharma. In fact, it's not just philosophy. As I've said with many of the things that I've taught in this series, this teaching on the 3 characteristics or seals or marks, it's a tool that we can use in our practice. Think of it like the lens. If you have glasses or wear contacts, think of it like the lens of your glasses. It's something we can look through and observe our experience so that we can see more clearly. Because if we can start to understand this teaching, then we can start to undo that process of trying to cling to things and hold on to them and rely upon them for happiness. One of my professors at school likes this. He talks about how we lean on things for happiness. But if we can start to undo that wrong process, if we can change that process, then we can undo a lot of our suffering. So that's what this is for. It's not just some idea that the Buddha came up with so he could sit around with other philosophers and talk about ideas. No. Everything in the Dharma, in the Buddha's teaching, is designed to help us overcome suffering. In Western philosophy, I'm not an expert in Western philosophy, but I've heard others say this. There are people who like to come up with ideas just because they're interesting ideas, and then they write about these ideas and they talk about them and they debate them with others. The Buddha didn't do any of that. Everything in the Buddha's teaching is designed to help us purify our ignorance, overcome our ignorance, so that we can wake up, and then we don't suffer anymore, and we can lead others on the path out of suffering. So that's what this is used for. So I will stop talking there, and I will see if anyone has any questions. Again, you can ask me about this or anything else you're curious about in the Dharma. Oops, I forgot to turn this on today. Yes?
Yeah. Talking about Western philosophy, I think it's part of the Western philosophy more or less reflects Buddha philosophy. Like Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, in his analysis, he also tried to help people to suffer less. So if we understand his philosophy, it reflects more or less Buddha philosophy.
Yeah, there are some people who have tried to find similarities between certain kinds of Western philosophy and Buddhism. And it's not like only the Buddha discovered things that were true. So there have been other people in history who have found bits and pieces of it. But the Buddha really brought it together. I think that's the difference. And it's a much more focused thing. Again, I'm not an expert in Western philosophy, though, so I can't give examples. But yeah, there have been Western philosophers who have come up with bits and pieces that are similar to Buddhism, or at least parts of the Buddhist teaching. But not always, I think.
Because I like Sigmund Freud. When I read Sigmund Freud, I see some reflection of Buddha philosophy.
Oh, perhaps, yeah. Particularly here in America, people, when converts like me to Buddhism, when we approach the Dharma, we tend to look at it through the lens of psychology. Even though we haven't, even if we've never taken a psychology class, we tend to look at Buddhism as a psychological thing because the prevailing view in our culture now is psychological. And so that's how we look at it. In some other cultures in the past, like when Buddhism went to Tibet, the pre-Buddhist Tibetan religion was sort of a mixture of shamanism and animism. They believed in like spirits in the water and this kind of thing, and there were lots of magical rituals and that sort of thing. And so a lot of that mixed with the Dharma. And so that's sort of the flavor of Tibetan Buddhism, or part of the flavor of Tibetan Buddhism. But in the West, we sort of, a lot of Western converts aren't really interested, not across the board, but a lot of Western converts aren't really interested in sort of the high ritual, magical kind of aspects of traditional Asian Buddhism. We look at it through the lens of psychology, actually. So thank you. Yes?
So, with all the facts that you've informed, I mean, if I read number one, then I would understand, okay, impermanent. And then my question is there a process of understanding? Is like the first thing is to understand Annica?
Anicca.
Yeah. Okay. And then do I understand the Dukkha? And then is there like a concrete process?
Oh, like a 1, 2, 3?
Yes. Because right now it's all blurred. Like right now I'm just absorbing all the different facts and all the different, not facts, but rules, I guess.
Or information. Yeah.
And so how do I make it more functional and be part of my daily life? I don't know if that makes sense.
Take what you can from this that you do understand and keep it in mind. This is the process. It's not really a 1, 2, 3 process. This is a list, but it's not like first you understand or impermanence, then you understand suffering, and then you understand non-self, right? Those are the 3 things. It's not like it goes necessarily 1, 2, 3. The process, though, is simply slow. That's the process. So take what you can from this, keep it in mind. And then when you think of it, when you're experiencing something, particularly when you're experiencing something unpleasant, then think about impermanence. Think about how, or even when you're experiencing something pleasurable, I don't want to ruin anyone's good time, but even when you're experiencing something pleasurable, think, this won't last. And then slowly over time, as you hear more teachings from different teachers related to these subjects, then it will start to come together bit by bit. So that's the process. That's the process. Keep it in mind. Keep reminding yourself of it. Keep trying to learn more. Read if you have time, Dharma books if you have time. And then over time, you slowly start to piece it together and fill it out. It's sort of like putting together a puzzle, and right now you've got 10 pieces of the 1,000-piece puzzle, right? Yeah. Good question. Other questions? Yes?
Can you explain the concept of a Dharma name?
The concept of a Dharma name. Okay. Well, I can give you my opinion of the subject. Maybe a different teacher would give a different answer, but for monks and nuns, we receive Dharma names. Like my name is Hue Hai, which means ocean of wisdom. And I think there are 2 reasons why we receive these Dharma names. It's because when we become monastics, we are letting go of our lay lives. We're taking on a new identity as monastics. And then the name itself doesn't mean that I am an ocean of wisdom. I'm most certainly not. it's something to aspire to. Yeah. And so I think for lay people as well, that's the same thing. If you receive a Dharma name, look at the meaning of that name. And it's often, I won't say always, because I haven't heard translations for every Dharma name, but often it's something to aspire to. It's a quality that the teacher is encouraging you to develop. So maybe because Hue Hai means ocean of wisdom. My original Dharma name when I became a novice in the Tibetan tradition was Rinchen Gyatso. And that Gyatso is ocean. That's why I have ocean in my Vietnamese name. But maybe I was named Hue Hai because they saw I had no wisdom. And they wanted me to like, hint, work on that. So yeah, that's what Dharma names are about. Yes?
Let's talk about the three seals of the Dharma. So sometimes I learned from the other teacher, that's the three seals, when we're talking about the Dharma, that's the three important seals. So we recognize the three Dharma, impermanent and no self, and suffering three seals. So that could be kept in mind, so we can recognize this Dharma, when the people talking about Dharma, should be the three seals in that, at least one in the Dharma talk. So sometimes like that, so they say the seal because
right.
Sometimes we have three characteristics of Dharma, but sometimes they say three seals.
Yes.
So that means recognize that's the Dharma.
Right. This is an important point. So. So this is one way that we can look at something that claims to be a Dharma teaching and see if it's authentic or not. So we can look at this and, so in other words, if there's a sutra, we're reading something that claims to be a Buddhist sutra, and if it says things are absolutely permanent, things do not change, well, we know that's not the Buddhist teaching. We can say, okay, no, that's not a legit sutra, right? Another, and also the Dharma teachings should include, the sutras and other Dharma teachings should include impermanence, suffering, and also non-self. Another one, sometimes we say that there are four seals, and the fourth one is nirvana, right? Enlightenment, essentially. And so another thing is if the teaching is about nirvana, the peace of nirvana, then it's also an authentic teaching.
Excuse me.
Yes?
Can you explain more about myself, about person? I know things change and it's nothing by self.
Right.
But how a person, a real person.
Right.
Can you explain more about no self?
Okay. So I have this identity, this personality that I think of as Hue Hai. Right. And of course I had a name when I was born, a different name when I was born, and all of that. And I think that I'm real, but I'm not. When I was an infant, my parents gave me a name when I was born, right? And in a sense, we say there that I am that infant as an adult. But if I think about it, I'm not the same as I was when I was an infant. I'm not the same as when I was 5, 15, 25. Now I'm 40. Right? And then someday I'll be, if I'm lucky, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 110 years old. And then eventually I will pass away. Okay? And as I'm going through life, I change. We all change. I certainly hope if you're in your 20s or 30s, you don't think the same as you did when you were 5 years old. Sometimes I do, maybe. So we all change through our lives, but then when I die, Hue Hai no longer exists. Hue Hai is not reborn again. Hue Hai ceases to exist. So all of those aspects of my personality, the language that I speak, the body of knowledge that I have, all of that is gone. What passes from this life into the next life is consciousness with like the impression of my karma. That's what passes into the next life. That's what sets the stage for my next life. Now, we can take this a little bit further, and there are Buddhist teachings that say that in fact consciousness, it's not like this ball of light that's sitting within me like a soul that moves into a new body. That consciousness is constantly arising and ceasing, arising and ceasing, arising and ceasing. And so this moment of consciousness is gone. But it sets the stage. It conditions this moment of consciousness to arise. So it's not like this one continuous string. It's this very rapid series of moments that come and go, come and go, come and go, come and go. So if I really, really look closely at this thing that I call myself, it's not real. It's also just this constantly changing something. So I can talk about that a little bit intellectually, but I'm not an enlightened being. So I don't really get that. So my ability to talk about that is somewhat limited, maybe very limited. But that's as I understand it. That just like this table, this bench, the microphone, the clothes that I'm wearing, this thing that I call I is constantly changing and is impermanent. Now, sometimes when people hear this, they get a little bit afraid because they want to cling to this idea of a self that is real and permanent, and that makes them feel safe. But in fact, by clinging to this idea of an I and trying to make it real and solid and unchanging, we create lots of suffering because inevitably things change. So in fact, if we can let go of clinging to this idea of a real self, then we can let go of a whole lot of suffering as well. Yes?
But how would that encourage us to be a better person?
Well, I don't know if it would. I don't know if I would phrase it that way, encouraging us to be a better person. Although perhaps if we see our own impermanence, and then we see the impermanence of others, and then we might see them suffering because they're fighting that impermanence, and then we might feel compassion for them. Maybe in that way, it would encourage us to be a better person. But it's really not, it's not about being a better person. It's about suffering less. Awakening, right? So what we're doing in Buddhist practice is we're learning about our ignorance. We're learning about how we cause suffering for ourselves and for others. And then what we're doing is seeing the views that we hold that lead us to behave in that way. Right? So what we're doing then is we're learning more and more skillful views, more and more skillful ways of seeing our experience, until eventually we don't need to rely upon any views or anything, and then we're awake. Right? So one way that we can approach Dharma practice, though, I wouldn't say don't try to be a better person. Because obviously, when we're mean to people, when we hurt others, we're creating negative karma that brings suffering to ourselves, right? So it's really good to try and work to overcome anger and jealousy and selfishness and so on. That's part of the process of growing in the Dharma. So it isn't that Buddhism isn't about becoming a better person, but that's only part of it, I think. Other questions? Let me check the time here real quick. The clock on this is off again. Can somebody tell me what time it is? 3:48. Okay, this is a good time. This is a good time to stop. Okay, so thank you very much.